Salahdin Part 5. In failure, he learned to succeed. The 26th November, 1177. As the sun rose in the desert of the Sinai Peninsula, a small group of horsemen were moving at lightning speed towards Cairo. This group of horsemen consisted of Salahdin and a handful of his bodyguards. Salahdin himself rode in the middle of the group, his mind clouded with fury and embarrassment. He was thinking about the defeat he had endured just the afternoon before. He'd had all the advantages, and yet his mission failed. How could that be? How could he lose to the Crusaders? To understand Salahdin's defeat at the Battle of Montgisard, we have to look a few weeks beforehand, when Salahdin launched his campaign in early November of 1177. He had 18,000 soldiers plus 8,000 elite Mamluks. The Mamluks were highly trained, most skilled, and were the most enduring units of Salahdin's army. They can be compared to the knights in European armies of the 12th century. Salahdin's army was strong enough to face any army that the Crusader states could muster. Upon entering the Crusader territory, his army started raiding with the aim to cut the food supply to different Crusader strongholds. Salahdin quickly passed the Crusader fortresses at Tarum and Gaza. He left a small garrison at each of these fortresses but did not engage in battle. Soon, the army reached Ascalon, a heavily fortified and strategically important Crusader city. Here, Salahdin camped his main forces and sent some troops around to raid even deeper into the Crusader heartland to create panic and fear. However, he didn't lay siege on the city itself. It's a rare instance when Salahdin left enemy strongholds unattacked behind his front line. First Daruma and Gaza, then later Ascalon. This would prove to be a costly mistake by Salahdin in the coming days. Initially, Salahdin's soldiers faced little to no resistance in their advancement. Some troops even reached Ramla, around 40 kilometers from Jerusalem. It seemed just a matter of time before Salahdin would appear at the gates of Jerusalem with his army. This advancement by Salahdin's army caused great panic among the Crusaders. King Baldwin IV called for every able man in his kingdom to bear arms and join the battle. Although suffering from leprosy, his health was stable enough for him to ride with his army to the battle. Answering his call, princes from the different crusading states joined his army. Among them was Reynold of Chatillon, Prince of Carac, a name we would see returning frequently in future events. Now back to Baldwin IV's battle plan. He had to prove to his subjects that he was a capable king who would face the attackers and not simply let his kingdom be taken away. He decided not to wait until Salahdin reached Jerusalem, rather to ride out and take the battle to Ascalon. This was a bold decision considering he only had 7,000 men to face off against Salahdin's 26,000. But he had to reach Ascalon with his army, avoiding Salahdin's raiding troops. If discovered before reaching Ascalon, he would not be able to defend his army. In an unfortunate turn of events, the scouts sent by Baldwin found that the Muslim troops spread out too thin to create a solid blockade at Ascalon. The groups were so far apart from each other that they would not be able to reassemble without significant delay. Seeing such gaps and a lack of discipline, the Crusaders took the opportunity and moved towards Ascalon through the gaps of the Muslim encirclement. Although late, the news reached Salahdin before Baldwin IV's arrival in Ascalon. Yet, surprisingly, he decided not to engage this time as well. We cannot know for sure what was going on in Salahdin's mind. Perhaps he thought he could pin down Baldwin in Ascalon without spending the strength of his army, and this way making it easier to capture Jerusalem without the king present. But before Salahdin could put his plan into action, Baldwin IV surprised Salahdin. On the afternoon of the 25th of November, 1177, Baldwin IV, with around 375 knights, heavily protected under metal armors and with strong horses, attacked Salahdin's central camp near Ascalon. The rest of the army followed and smashed against the Muslim front line. Salahdin realized the threat too late. Although he had sent orders to his scattered troops to gather, they could not reorganize quickly enough to put up a resistance. Salahdin stepped back and tried to pull his forces on top of a hill called Montgisard. But the powerful charge by the Crusaders did its trick and Salahdin's lines were broken. Salahdin tried to rally his troops 2 times to counter the attack, but both attempts failed. The soldiers started to flee. The Crusader knights reached so close to Salahdin that there were only a few elite Mamluk guards to protect the Sultan. By Salahdin's own description of the events, a Templar knight came so close to him that he tried to hit Salahdin on the chest with a lance. Luckily, 3 of Salahdin's bodyguards were close enough and could come to his aid before the Sultan was injured. Salahdin had to retreat. The whole Muslim camp, even Salahdin's personal tent, was lost. Although Salahdin could retreat safely, his army could not. Only a part of his force fought at Montgisard and were thrashed by the Crusaders. The other groups, who were spread out too far and were also attacked from all sides later on. Even while retreating, the fortresses that were left unattacked behind the front line became a constant source of attack and harassment for his soldiers. The defeat at Montgisard was a serious setback for Salahdin's plan. No doubt he was sad and embarrassed, but the political consequences far outweighed any emotional damage. Salahdin was now incredibly vulnerable. His kingdom was exposed both to the Crusaders and to his competitors in Syria. The morale of the Muslims was at the lowest it had been in decades. Meanwhile, the Crusaders were having victory parades showing off the spoils of battle. Salahdin safely reached Cairo, and from there he started reorganizing. Now what we know about Salahdin is that he was no quitter. He had surely learned many hard lessons in the aftermath of the Battle of Montgisard, and our guy Salahdin was someone who learns from his mistakes. The next time, Salahdin would be prepared for surprises. How much Salahdin evolved as a leader after this event was obvious in the events that unfolded in the following months. The Crusaders, boosted in morale with their victory, launched attacks at strategically important cities in Syria such as Hama and Damascus. Some of the emirs in Syria also rebelled against Salahdin, seeing his recent defeat. But Salahdin was prudent and swift in his damage control. He soon moved back to Syria and from there coordinated his forces on multiple fronts. The rebellion was swiftly taken under control, although not completely quelled. Then, there was a decisive victory of Salahdin's forces in Hama that stopped the Crusader incursion. Salahdin himself camped near Homs and engaged in skirmishes with the Crusaders. Salahdin emerged victorious from these skirmishes and stalled the Crusaders from advancing. But Baldwin IV still did not give up. In an attempt to create pressure, he started building a castle at a place called Jacob's Ford. It was a real threat to the Muslims because of the location of the castle. Situated only 80 kilometers from Damascus, an army from Jacob's Ford could reach Damascus within a couple of days. It was also along the pilgrimage route, so the Crusaders could attack caravans making their way to Mecca for Hajj. Salahdin decided to resolve this issue once and for all. He sent one of his generals, Farrukh Shah, to defend Damascus. While Baldwin IV advanced with his army towards Damascus, he expected almost no resistance. Instead, he met a formidable Muslim army and had to retreat after a humiliating defeat. Salahdin regained his confidence and the trust of the Muslims. These victories were essential for Salahdin at this crucial point. He could recover much of the military strength that was lost at the Battle of Montgisard. The morale of the Muslims was high again. He brought reinforcement from Egypt and completely pushed the Crusaders out of Syria. Salahdin might have lost a battle, but he was still very much capable of fighting and winning the war. Salahdin offered 100,000 pieces of gold to Baldwin IV to abandon the castle at Jacob's Ford, stating it would save lots of bloodshed on both sides. But his offer was refused. This was a clear provocation by the Crusaders. So Salahdin launched a campaign again into the northern Crusader territories in 1179. This would be the first campaign that Salahdin led himself since the Battle of Montgisard, almost 18 months prior. The Crusaders had to divide their forces from Jacob's Ford to answer Salahdin's offense. This was his plan, to split the Crusader army, and it worked. The two armies met in a series of battles near Banyas, Sidon, and Beirut, which are part of modern-day Lebanon. This time, Salahdin prevailed, and his army wiped out the Crusaders. These victories ensured bountiful food supply and riches for Salahdin's troops, while the Crusader army was significantly weakened. A number of high-ranked Crusader knights were captured and taken prisoner. With a brilliant move, Salahdin then decided to attack the Crusaders' station at Jacob's Ford immediately. This surprise move by Salahdin turned the battle into a race against time. It would take 5 to 6 days for reinforcements to arrive from Jerusalem to Jacob's Ford, so Salahdin had to capture the castle within 5 days to avoid a long and devastating siege. So the Muslims attacked the castle with their full might. Day 1. The outer defensive works were captured by the Muslims, but the 4-meter-thick main wall of the castle still held them back. Day 2. The wall was bombarded with siege weapons for hours. The wall still stood high. In a desperate attempt, the Muslims tried to overrun the wall with ladders, but they failed. Salahdin became even more desperate. He commanded his men to start digging a tunnel to go underneath the wall. The idea was to put explosives underneath the wall and blow the whole thing up from underground. Day 3. The attacks continued, but the wall stood strong. Meanwhile, the digging of the tunnel continued. Day 4. The tunnel was finally done. The order was given to set the explosives. The Muslims waited in anticipation for the explosion and the subsequent collapse of the wall. But that moment never came. The wall stood firm, meaning the tunnel did not reach close enough underneath the wall. Day 5. The Crusader reinforcement was only a day away. It was now or never. In a desperate attempt, the Muslims ran with buckets of water to put out the fires in the tunnel and dig further underground. The tunnel continued, but would it be finished in time? Day 6. As the sun rays peeked out across the horizon, Muslim soldiers put the explosives at the end of the newly dug tunnel and started the fire. Only a few hours were left before the Crusader reinforcements would arrive. Suddenly, there was a cracking sound, and then came a huge explosion. To the cheers of the Muslims, the stones of the wall shuddered, and the wall collapsed downwards. Finally, a breakthrough. A gap. The Muslims charged forward. The Crusaders gathered around the gap to create a choking point for the Muslims. From behind the infantry, the Muslim archers rained armor-piercing arrows down on the Crusaders. Desperate hand-to-hand combat ensued amidst the rubble and dark clouds of smoke. Inch by inch, the Muslims pushed in. The order was to show no mercy and take no prisoners. The Crusader reinforcement arrived nearby, but seeing the column of smoke from the distance, they lost hope and turned around. The Muslims dealt one final push, and finally, the castle was under Muslim control. Salahdin's yellow standard was finally flying over the tower of Jacob's Ford. In the following month, Salahdin showed an even broader strategic approach against the Crusaders. He had been working on rebuilding the Egyptian naval force for the last few months, and to show his strength, he launched a naval assault in another important Crusader city named Acre, just weeks after recapturing Jacob's Ford. Although being a shock and run mission, it successfully destroyed the harbor towers and several ships. After decades, Muslims now had a formidable navy. Salahdin once again showed how he had learned and improved from every setback in his life. The game had now turned. The Crusaders had lost the upper hand. Salahdin now dominated the borders of the Crusader states, both from land and sea. But with all the fighting continuing on the Western Front, a great storm was brewing elsewhere, moving fast to engulf Salahdin's empire. The political turmoil returned to Syria, and Reynold of Chatillon decided to attack Medina and kidnap the body of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in an act of revenge.